Good afternoon. My name is Catherine Infante from Amherst College, and today I'll be talking about the materials of captivity in the early modern Mediterranean. The constant contacts and the space between Spain and the rest of the Mediterranean world facilitated a number of contacts and exchanges that allowed members of different faiths to come in contact with each other. The frequent encounters between Christians and Muslims, captives, slaves, corsairs, renegades, redemptionist friars, merchants, among many others, populate the pages of many of the texts in 16th and 17th century Spain, of course by celebrated authors like Miguel de Cervantes and Lope de Vega. Likewise, paintings such as this one by Francisco Pacheco, representing the arrival of captives back to early modern Europe, represents also another canvas to think about the ways that people of diverse experiences understood these encounters and these exchanges that took place because of the captivity, human captivity. While many of these accounts of exchanges and encounters can tell us a lot about the people, what is also interesting is what these texts can also tell us about the objects that shared this space and circulated between shores of the Mediterranean Sea, many of them following the same trajectories as the humans. Objects such as clothing, silk, jewels, coral, food, religious objects, among many other goods, were also stolen, bought, exchanged, sold, alongside the human captives, and the traces of this material is incorporated into many texts, and by studying these objects, we can also learn a lot about the social relations that took place during this time. In the next few minutes, I'd like to just consider one case study from Miguel de Cervantes' El Amante Liberal, a short story or a novella published in his Novelas Ejemplares in 1613, to think about the ways that objects and the materials of captivity, what that can tell us about the human relations that took place. This novella tells the story of two young Sicilians, Leonisa and Ricardo, who were taken captive off the shores of Sicily, which was under the Spanish crown, and they're taken captives to Cyprus under Ottoman rule at the time. And they finally recuperate their freedom at the end of the story. While it's a fictional tale, of course, many of the elements in the narrative also speak to Miguel de Cervantes' own experience as a captive in Algiers from 1575 to 1580. This novella offers a fascinating case study, I think, to think about the question of objects and materials of captivity, because it also shows how these identities are negotiated within the work and how these objects influence the cultural encounters among the characters. In particular, I'm thinking about a dress that one of the main characters, Leonisa, is dressed in, this hábito berberisco, or a North African costume, perhaps similar to this one shown on the screen in this costume book, representing the dress of North Africa. When she's taken captive by a crew of Turkish pirates off the coast of Trapani, she then becomes the property of a Jewish merchant who dresses her lavishly in this hábito berberisco, this North African dress that's lavishly covered with gold embroidered silk and crimson taffeta veil, and it's described in a lot of detail. It also, she travels on a boat that is also filled with other textiles and objects, perhaps stolen, that the merchants has the intention to trade along with this human captive, Leonisa. And as we see, the dress plays an important role in shaping the social relations between the cast of Christian, Muslim, and Jewish characters in the text. Before I talk a little bit more about this specific example and her dress and the materials of captivity, I want to think for just a moment about how the captives also presented themselves visually when they returned from the Muslim Mediterranean to Spain, for example. They publicly enacted processions, and in these processions and ceremonies, many of them were required to take part in. Between 1561 and 1692, some 90 fundraising processions of ransomed captives took place in Madrid, for example. For these spectacles, the town magistrate ordered the streets swept and watered. The balconies and awnings were adorned with the best decorations, and the captives changed their clothes, washed themselves, and rested before joining in the processions. People of all ages and social classes came to watch the captives and to celebrate in these events. What's also interesting, though, is how the materials of captivity also form part, perhaps in some of these processions. Here we can see the slaves carrying some of their chains, representing their experience as captives. Other accounts talk about the bread, the pan moreno or darker integral bread that was carried at the front of the procession on a stick. So thinking about how these captives visually presented themselves and understanding this as kind of a performance where the materials of captivity served as a type of prop representing their experience and speaking to their encounters that took place. This is interesting when we returning back to the example, the case study from El Amante Liberal, because when the captives return back to Sicily at the end, Ricardo, the other main protagonist, puts on a type of spectacle or celebration that could, with an audience perhaps similar to what these celebrations that actually did take place in Madrid, among other places. In this case, Ricardo and the crew, they see their homeland. Ricardo richly decorates the boat with colorful streamers and flags, in which he gains the attention of all the audience in the harbor. He takes advantage of the spectators, and he decides to have Leonisa get dressed back into this North African costume. That's to say, to visually present herself with the materials of captivity in this North African dress before she arrives to the audience. And the audience, of course, is curious to listen quietly to their story and to watch the elegantly dressed characters come off the boat. Ricardo lifts up her taffeta veil at just the right moment to heighten this performative moment of bringing these materials back. With the North African dress as an active participant in the performance, the captives, we see that her dress and the particular role that it plays in mediating Mediterranean cultures and subjectivities. If we look back to the genesis of her dress, it begins with the Jewish merchant who first dresses her in it and appears numerous times until finally, at the end of the plot, she appears in this dress and these materials brought back from the Muslim Mediterranean. And what I want to conclude by thinking about is the mobility of these different cloths and garments, including the captive's costume, alongside the circulation of slaves and merchants, and how this hints at the regular encounters and exchanges and reuses of materials that make up Leonisa's dress. Even though her dress is described as North African, it first appears in the possession of this Jewish merchant, and even the very nature of the character's trade activities makes determining a certain point of the dress's origin seem less relevant and less important to define. These qualifiers or descriptions lose their meaning. They initially appear to mark the dress, but if we pay attention to the materiality of her dress, we see that it's actually much more complicated, and it exemplifies the experiences of the captives themselves, these more subjectivities. In fact, as fashion designer and cultural anthropologist Leila Belkaid Neri has shown, attire in the Mediterranean port cities such as Algiers was constantly transforming into what she calls entangled styles, reflecting the ethnic mixes of the peoples and the cultures of each region. The migratory movements of Jews and Muslims from Spain to North Africa, initiated by the Catholic King's conquest of the Iberian Peninsula and followed later by the Morisco expulsion at the start of the 17th century, has an influence on the North African dress. From exiled Moriscos' contributions to silk production, to Sephardic Jews' manufacture of gold thread, Leonisa's green silk dress covered in gold-embroidered braids participates in this economy and transformed by the migrations of peoples, techniques, and materials. Considering, if we think about the materials of her dress, the materiality of her costume, and the movements, it points to the interwoven, connected social fabric of the human relations that also take place, and the complications of trying to put certain people in certain categories when just like the materiality of her dress and these objects that form a good part of the narrative in Cervantes' El Amante Liberal, we see how the objects and people speak together to share this world. Thank you for your time.